I think it's appropriate. Defender's blue butterfly, I think one of the biggest dangers to it is not homeowners, it's the county, the state, and the federal regulation. The Native Plant Society was offering Kincaid lupin for homeowners to purchase and plant on their property. There is no way that I was going to buy any and put it on my property, because if I established 100 plants or 50 plants or whatever it is, then all of a sudden I've got Fender's blue habitat and I cannot do particular things to my property because of state regulations. If there were no regulations, I would have bought it and been happy to establish Fender's blue habitat on my property. But because you want to come and say, well, you've got this habitat, so therefore you cannot touch within a certain area, I'm not going there. And if the way you're handling regulatory and wetlands and the stream beds is going to get the same thing. We are going to back off, and instead of improving the habitat to its fullest extent, we're just going to do minimums or nothing or let it go to blackberries. So and it's not because we don't appreciate our land, it's because we are not going to be regulated.
And I understand that perspective completely. I would feel the same way. And I want to point out that with the Fender's blue butterfly, there is a program that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service
I'm not going
promotes,
there either.
which is that, and that's obviously it's individual choices, but if you want to establish habitat on your property, you can enter into an agreement with them where they will recognize the habitat that you establish, and you're not responsible for harm that comes to that habitat in the future. So it's a I forget what the name of it is, but I can get you the information. But I hear that you're not interested
because it's another. It's allowing them onto my property to tell me, you know, which can lead to more regulations and loss of property value.
Well, it's there as an option to people who do want to.
I appreciate that.
And we're trying to build similar flexibility into the program here. So we're almost out of time. I'm going to let you have a moment because you haven't had a chance yet, and then we'll let Mike talk a little bit about the poster that he's brought.
I guess one of the things that is confusing to me is at the meeting at the Grange in LC, I believe the question was posed to you, the two of you, as to what data you had. You mentioned data, and you're going to consult the data in checking all this out. You didn't have any data at that meeting in LC. You said it seemed that nobody could find anything that was wrong with the water and with the river. And these people have done a wonderful job protecting their property and the animals and the fish and the river. So how are you going to check data if you didn't have any data? If you couldn't find anything wrong that needed to be corrected? That doesn't make sense to me.
Right, right. It's a good question. The data that we have is, and Adam, maybe you should address this because you know it better than I do, but that there's a temperature concern in the Alsea Basin. There are concerns about certain fisheries in that basin, and specifically with the temperature, that's why we're backing off on developing the program in the Alsea Basin until DEQ, who temperature and water quality parameters are really their jurisdiction. They're analyzing the data and will be developing requirements, and so then we'll take a look at those requirements and figure out if we need to do something or not. So that's, and Adam can get you more of the data that we have. We have a whole inventory report that addresses the available data. But it is a key question, and that's something we've worked on quite a bit.
Speaking of data.
Speaking of data.
Mike's done a lot of work, so we should give him his time here.
Okay, set that up on the lip there, would you please, Adam?
I commended Mike on actually drying it himself.
I didn't, I had to take my tongue back from Jane. I told Adam I wouldn't say anything. It was my turn. And Jane almost forgot to give it back to me.
Hey,
You did very well, Mike.
I want to talk about data. I think in terms that you all can identify with, and most of you here.
you got some tape.
I had a neighbor who wanted to hunt on my tree farm. He wanted to go elk hunting, and I said, "You got any elk out there?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "How many do you suppose you have out there?" And I said, "Well, there's probably 140. And he said, "Okay." And he went out hunting and came back the next day, and I said, "Well, did you get anything?" And he said, "No, but sure did a lot of shooting." And I said, "Well, how come you missed?" And he said, "Well, I never could see them." I said, "Well, what were you shooting at?" Well, he said, "Well, you said there were 30 elk out there, 40 elk, something like that. And I shot 10 times, didn't get anything." And I said, "Well, you know, you kind of have to know what you're dealing with. You have to know where it is." And then I said, "You also have to know how far away it is, whether you can actually get there from here." Well, we're dealing that way with quality criteria for regulation, and I've got a chart here of the Marys River system downstream from areas where we did a lot of research over the last decade, and along several tributaries we've worked in the last 20 years. And this year, Adam and I did a bunch of work on the main stem. So this is a kind of a blown up look at the Marys River Basin from the headwaters clear over here, 50 stream miles from the confluence with the river. And this axis here, those of you who are graph crazy like I am will understand it perfectly. But on this axis, it's temperature of the stream, and on this axis is elevation and feed, and there's a link. So what happens, what I'm going to talk about is whether after you look at the data, you can understand that you can get to where you want to go from here. Now, regulations for TMDLs, DEQ will say, well, they've already stated that the Marys River is impaired to river mile 13.9 for temperature. That was one of the biggies for declaring TMDLs on Marys. Okay, so I said, well, where are the data? Do you know what's there? Well, there was one data point clear down here at South 53rd Street where there was a gauging station, and there was a year or two of data from down there about what the temperature was. And I said, but if you're going to do an overlay on the whole stream, you really need to know what the stream is doing. Now, I circulated some graphs. We put 8 recorders along the river, and sometime in August, we captured the highest temperature week in the summer, and also periods of warm and low temperatures. And so what I've done here is I've charted from where the water comes out of the ground. Now, mind you, when water comes out of the ground here, it's almost all dominated by winter precipitation. It goes down, it soaks in, it soaks down, and doesn't drain off with great excess in the winter time. In the summer, the surface layers dry out. So what trickles into the streams is the deep leakage from the rocks, okay? It's almost all between 11 and 12 degrees centigrade, which is 50 to 53 degrees Fahrenheit. And when it comes out of the ground, as soon as it's exposed to the air, it starts taking on the temperature of its immediate environment. It gets some sunshine and it gets some warm air. So as soon as it's out of the ground, as water bubbles up, it comes into the stream, and in the first 2 miles, which is only down to here, it warms 4 or 5 degrees, or maybe even more. And there really is nothing you can do about that, whether it's got timber over it or whether it's got clear cut. We put a clear cut across this 8 years ago, And the only thing that happened to this red line, by the way, is the maximum temperature in the warmest week of the summer. We put a clear cut in there and took away all the buffers and everything, and it warmed up 2 degrees centigrade. That's a fairly heavy warm up. And then as soon as it went back into cover, instead of continuing to rise as it had been on its original course, what it did is it fell back into the original pattern. Now the DEQ says it doesn't cool. They have a model called heat source, and I've criticized DEQ's use of the heat model, heat source, and I recommend that you follow through on that, because the data that I'm going to present to you right now are a total vindication of the abandonment of that model. And that's going to jerk the rug out from under DEQ and a lot of EPA's work on the West Coast. So anyway, once it goes back into the standard, the untreated river, it just kind of drifts along here and it creeps up, and at Blodgett was where we started keeping track there, and between Blodgett and Harris Bridge, it went up 4 degrees. Okay, it's a confluence with Tum Tum Creek. Tum Tum was a warm trib.
That was centigrade, right?
That's centigrade. And once it got to Harris, it was up to 23 degrees. That's this dotted black line here. That is the cold water standard, the maximum temperature within the cold water standard. We're already 4 degrees above the cold water standard. There are some places between Tum Tum and some power lines crossing the creek. There's some places where there's some fairly serious collection of heat above Harris. But there's not much disturbance below Harris. And what's really interesting is, does the water cool off? No, it doesn't. It stays high. At Wren, it was 24 plus degrees. That's 75, something like that. And stays there. To Wren, didn't move. We had a cold confluence where we ran into both Woods Creek and Greasy Creek. Our confluences fairly close together. That dumped a lot of cold water, dropped a couple of degrees, and within a mile of the confluence of the Greasy Creek, it was back up all the way to 24 and a fraction. And it stayed perfectly flatlined till we got to Avery Park and the Willamette River. Okay, now the thing that I'm going to that breaks or pick on this picture is those diagrams there are all the exact same interval of time, and it shows that 7 days after we installed the thermistors, all the same day, Harris peaked. 7 days after we installed it at Avery Park peaked. It took 14 days for the water to go from Harris to Avery Park. Those diagrams say that every night it lost the heat it gained during the day, and every day it gained a new charge of heat. Up 4, down 4, up 4, down 4. The peaks never moved downstream. The whole river was working in sync. DEQ's model says that when heat is collected, it stays there, so it presumably gets warmer and warmer. I have a diagram here that, where'd the rest of them go?
Oh, I got it, I'm sorry.
Oh, you got it. Thief!
I was looking at the peaks and
Okay.
troughs.
I want you to look, can you see this diagram? It looks like up and down, okay? We superimpose the Wren data on Avery Park data. Up, down, exactly the same time of day that they peaked and exactly the same time of day they bottomed out. The DEQ model does not work. This is a 100% failure. Now, the part of the problem, now let's go back to the question of data. We would not have known this if we hadn't decided to get some data. It takes detailed data to learn what you have to work with.
Thank you.
Now,
I wanted to say something on the heat source model. When you were here with the DQ folks, when they were explaining that model, I think they understood your points on the up down. They understand those physics of it. Their input, though, as I recall from folks that were here, was that if there was additional cover, you wouldn't see such a high level of temperature
what
to begin with.
what I'm telling you is that this water vacillated exactly the same for 15 days as it went down through here. It went through areas where there was very little cover. It went through areas where there was a lot of cover with the same amplitude of fluctuation. And after we went through a cold confluence here, the next recording station, it gained 100% of that heat back. Now that says something. It says how much control we have over that system. I mean, it has a huge amount of ability to gain and lose energy. When you think of the volume of water in that whole river, gaining heat and losing heat on a 24-hour cycle with not more than a few minutes out of sync, you realize that you're really barking up a very, very tall tree to get it to do your bidding.
Not necessarily.
Well, just
I mean, I can tell you.
well, just
yeah.
wait.
Yeah, so I don't know
Okay.
what you
What we see
No, it's
is
science.
what we see is that the water equilibrates with the climatic regime. Air temperature is having more effect on this water temperature than the sunshine, which violates a lot of the rules and existing regulations. What's fascinating here is we go 6 degrees centigrade over the cold water standard, and it pretty much stays there. And that tells you that there is no way in God's green earth that trying to regulate this water to meet the cold water standard will work. It's out of reach. It's out of range. It is way out of range, okay? Because you have no way of complete controlling what the air temperature does as well as the cover. You might gain a little bit if you got it completely covered with tall trees, but you wouldn't eliminate more than a fraction of that
That's what you're
fluctuation.
saying.
Yeah,
That's the point. Basically, you have diurnal. So basically, it's going up and down the whole river basin. I mean, the whole river profile, right?
That's
So
right.
Basically, it's a diurnal fluctuation during the day,
Yep.
day and night.
About 4
Okay, so
centigrade.
it's about going up and down. So the idea is that landscape, the cover of that whole area is pretty much homogeneous, and basically not a lot of trees along the whole thing. So the idea is if you actually begin to recover that area, doing the good stuff you're doing at Woods Creek, actually you get more. I mean, that was a good, you guys are helping the creek a lot. So basically, if you put more shade, that's a shade model, basically more shade, that fluctuation, rather than going like this, basically goes like this. So you go like this,
No.
and so
Well,
you go
that's
down
not-
like
that's
this.
No.
These data, when you
Yeah.
look at the way these data
That's what the-
go from period of bright hot sun, that's where the peaks are. Then we went through a cool day, a cool period with complete overcast, and notice that the water dropped about 8 degrees and then fluctuated plus or minus 4 during the period of that overcast when the sun really wasn't a big issue. It will not do your bidding.
Well, this is,
Yeah.
Mike, this is really interesting
Yeah, anyway.
Yeah.
data, and
Yeah.
we're over time,
You're
so
over
let's
time.
take, do you have copies of this
I'm
that we
just
can
gonna,
review?
I don't have copies of these, but I can get some made if you, and
I have the Excel.
Adam's got all
Okay,
basic
okay,
data.
so, because we would like to take a look at it and discuss it and.
Right.